The morning Silas Dunn cut into that apple pie, the whole world went quiet. He was sitting at the old porch table, still warm, set on the wooden rail like it had always belonged. He looked up just in time, a flash of dark red hair disappearing around the corner of the fence line, moving fast like she didn't want to be seen. He picked up his knife. The blade hit something that wasn't apple, wasn't crust. He pulled it out slow, a folded piece of paper, edges brown with grease. He didn't open it for a long time, just staring at his own name written in a dead man's hand. She had been leaving the pies since August. Willa Harper, Joseph Harper's widow. 32 years old, dark red hair, living alone across the field with nothing but apple trees and grief and the particular stubbornness of a woman who has decided to survive. Silas had never thanked her, not once. He told himself it was because he hadn't been certain who was leaving them. That wasn't true. He knew. He just couldn't bring himself to make it real, because making it real meant accepting something from another person, and Silas Dunn hadn't done that in 5 years. Not since Margaret died, and he signed the mortgage with the land and trust and told himself he would handle it alone. He had been handling it alone ever since, $41 short of what he owed, January coming fast. And now there was a piece of paper in his hand with his name on it, written by a man 2 weeks in the ground. He unfolded it. He read it once. He read it again. Then he set it down on the porch table, very carefully, and looked across the field at the Harper place. Willa was already gone, but her kitchen window was lit. He stood up, put on his hat, and walked. She was hanging laundry when he came through the gate. She turned, removed the wooden peg from between her teeth, said nothing. He held out the deed. "Your husband put this in the pie," Silas said. 12 acres, creek-fed, my name on it. He paused. "I don't think you knew what was in it." Willa looked at the paper without touching it. "I found a sealed envelope in his things 3 weeks ago. Your name on the outside." She met his eyes. "It wasn't mine to open. So you baked it into a pie? I didn't think you'd take it any other way." A silence. "You were right," Silas said. She took the deed from his hand. She read it slowly. When she looked up, something had shifted behind her eyes. Not surprise, but the particular expression of a person recognizing a plan they didn't know was being made for them. "He knew about the debt," she said quietly. "He must have. He never said a word to me about any of this." Silas looked at her. "He knew I wouldn't take it from a person standing in front of me. He knew I'd have to find it myself." A long pause. Smart man. Willa folded the deed back along its original lines. "The deed needs to be filed," Silas said. "Aldrich Kane will fight it. The moment he sees 12 acres transferred to my name, he'll claim it was designed to undercut the lien. He's done it to 2 other families in this county." "I know what Kane does," Willa said. Her voice was steady. "I also know that Dr. Whitfield witnessed this deed, and he keeps his records going back 20 years. She looked at Silas directly. "How much are you short?" "That's not..." "How much, Mr. Dunn?" Silas was quiet for a moment. $41, he said. Willa nodded once, the way a woman nods when the number confirms what she already suspected. "Joseph's account at the Sheridan savings," she said. "It's mine to use for the benefit of the property. The south parcel runs along our shared fence line. That makes me a party to this whether you like it or not. I don't take charity. I'm not offering charity." Her voice didn't rise, didn't need to. "Joseph made a decision about this land before he died. I intend to see it carried through. That's not about you." A pause. "That's about him." Silas looked at her for a long time. He had spent 5 years building walls he called self-sufficiency. He had confused being uncomplaining with being strong, and they are not the same thing. A man who carries his grief entirely alone and calls it dignity is simply alone with his grief. That's all it is. He had not asked for help in 5 years. He was about to. "I have a lawyer's name in Cheyenne," he said finally. "Fellow named Garrett. He's seen the land and trust's acceleration clause pattern before. Might take the case on contingency." Willa looked at him steadily. "Then between the 2 of us, we might have enough to make Kane think twice before he starts something he can't finish." Another silence. The kind that isn't uncomfortable. The kind between 2 people who have just, without ceremony or announcement, agreed to something. "I'll send the telegram today," Silas said. "I'll pull Joseph's files tonight," Willa said. He nodded, turned to leave. "Mr. Dunn." He stopped. "The tins," she said. "You always return them clean." He didn't turn around. It was the least I could do. "It was something," she said. "For a man who couldn't say thank you, it was something." He walked back across the field. The paper was still warm in his breast pocket, or maybe that was just the October sun, or the photograph of Margaret he kept there, or the particular heat that comes from a thing you've been carrying alone for too long and have finally, for the first time, agreed to carry differently. Aldrich Kane came on Monday, as he always did. He tied his horse outside the gate with the relaxed ease of a man who has never once arrived anywhere he was not expected to win. He came up the porch steps in his good dark coat, brass buttons catching the thin October light, and arranged his pleasant expression with the practiced precision of someone who uses pleasantness the way other men use a sidearm, not often, and always with calculation. He had heard about the deed. The recorder's office in Sheridan County was not known for its discretion, and Pettigrew, the clerk, had a wife who attended the same prayer circle as Kane's secretary. These things travel. He sat down at Silas's porch table without being invited. He set his leather satchel on the rail and unbuckled it slowly, the way a man does when he wants you to notice he has documents and is not in any hurry. He explained, at considerable length, that the recent conveyance of the Harper South parcel to Silas Dunn presented certain complications with respect to the existing lien instrument on the Dunn property, and that the land and trust, in its fiduciary capacity and with the utmost respect for all parties, would be obliged to seek legal clarification regarding the collateral implications of said transfer before any further payment schedule discussions could proceed. He said all of this without once dropping the pleasant expression. Silas listened to every word without moving, without blinking more than necessary. The way a man who has been counting his money for 5 years and coming up short every single time learns to listen when someone is explaining, pleasantly, why things will continue to be difficult. When Kane finished, there was a silence. Then Silas said, "Dr. Whitfield keeps his records." Kane's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind it did a small, careful adjustment, like a man shifting his weight on uncertain ground. "All of them," Silas said. "Going back 20 years. He's a thorough man, makes copies of everything he witnesses." A pause. "I also had occasion this past week to speak with a lawyer in Cheyenne, a fellow by the name of Garrett. He handles property matters. He's had occasion to look at the Land and Trust's history of acceleration clause applications in Sheridan County, the Alderson claim, the Price Farm, 2 others I won't name. He found the pattern of those applications interesting enough to take this matter on contingency." The pleasantness didn't disappear from Kane's face. It simply became more careful, like a man who has stepped onto river ice and is now listening, very still, for the sound it makes. "There's no need for this to become adversarial," Kane said. "No," Silas said, "there isn't." A long silence, the kind in which things are understood without being said. "The current balance," Kane said at last, "could perhaps be renegotiated, given the improved collateral position." "Yes," Silas said, "it could." He stood up and showed Kane the gate. Kane left without looking back. His horse's hooves on the dirt road made a sound like a problem. Walking away not resolved, but retreating, which is sometimes the best you can ask for. They had filed the deed on a Thursday, 4 days after Silas walked across the field with it in his breast pocket. Silas and Willa had walked into the county recorder's office together, which was enough of an event to fuel the First Methodist Ladies Auxiliary through the better part of a month. A widow and an old farmer going somewhere official on a Thursday morning, the theories constructed from that single fact alone could have filled a modest novel. Pettigrew, the clerk, had blinked considerably at the document, but the witness signature of Dr. Whitfield was in order. The grantor had been alive and of sound mind at the time of signing, and the law did not require the dead to be present for their intentions to be honored. He stamped it. He entered it in the ledger in his careful, cramped hand. He handed back the certified copy without comment, though he did watch them leave with an expression that suggested he intended to comment extensively to someone else before the afternoon was out. The renegotiation that followed took 3 weeks. Garrett, the lawyer from Cheyenne, was a gray-bearded man with the particular kind of patience that comes from having sat across many tables from many men who assumed their position was stronger than it was. The second was addressed to the Wyoming State Banking Commission, noting that a pattern of acceleration clause applications by the Sheridan County Land and Trust might merit regulatory attention. The second letter was never sent. It did not need to be. The Land and Trust agreed to a restructured payment schedule at 8% per annum. The 12-acre south parcel was recognized as additional collateral, improving Silas's position materially. The acceleration trigger, that particular clause on the fourth page that had been Kane's primary instrument for 5 years, was removed from the agreement entirely. Kane delivered the revised terms on a Monday morning. He was as pleasant as ever. He complimented the state of the fencing. Silas accepted the documents without expression and showed him the gate for what he suspected and hoped would be the last time. He sat at his kitchen table and counted the tin box. He had enough. Not comfortable, not extra, but enough, the number finally arriving at the right side of the ledger and staying there. He had spent 5 years on the edge of enough to know that it is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only thing a man needs to start from, if he is willing to start. He put the box back under the floorboard, got his coat, and walked across the field. It was Willa who found the other document. She had been putting it off for weeks, the cedar chest at the back of the bedroom, pushed into the corner where the winter light didn't reach. She had gone through everything else: the desk in the parlor, the wooden box he kept under the bed, the shelf above the wardrobe where he stored papers he considered important and correspondence he considered finished with. The cedar chest was the last place, and she had understood in the clear-eyed way of a woman who has survived the unsurvivable and knows her own mind that once she looked, there would be no more places left to look, that the cedar chest was the last drawer of Joseph Harper that she hadn't opened, and opening it would mean there were no more drawers. She opened it on a Tuesday evening in early November, with the lamp lit and the kitchen warm behind her. Most of it was what she expected: old documents, a Bible with pressed flowers between the pages. She had not known about the flowers, and she sat with it for a long time before she could put it down. A folded survey map of the property from 1875, the year before they arrived. A lock of hair in a paper envelope she recognized as her mother's handwriting. And at the very bottom, beneath everything else, a single folded piece of paper with no envelope, no seal, and no name on the outside. She unfolded it at the kitchen table. It was a letter. Written in Joseph's hand, the same careful, unhurried script she had been reading for 12 years, the handwriting of a man who believed that how you wrote something said as much as what you wrote. He had written about Silas, about watching from across the fence line as Silas Dunn built himself into a smaller and smaller version of himself over the years, not in meanness, not in cowardice, but in the particular kind of pride that is really just fear wearing formal clothes. The pride that says, I can manage alone. The pride that has learned to mistake its own walls for virtue. The pride that does not know how to receive because it has never had to. And now, having forgotten, no longer knows that it is forgotten. He had written about the debt, about seeing the Land and Trust's ledger during his time on the county assessor's board and understanding, without any room for doubt, what Kane was doing and how long it would take. About deciding over the course of one long winter what he could do about it. And then he had written, I want him to have something he cannot work for or earn or repay, something that comes to him simply because someone who knew him decided to give it. I think Silas Dunn needs to be forced just once into the position of having received something freely to learn that the world is not entirely a transaction, that some things are given because the giver wanted to give them, and the only decent response is to accept. I hope Willa finds a way to give it to him that he can bear. I think she will know how. She sat with that last line for a long time. Then she folded the letter, carefully, along the original fold lines. She got her coat. She walked across the field in the dark, the snow just beginning, the first flakes coming down sparse and quiet in the lamplight from Silas's kitchen window. She knocked on his door. He He answered with his lamp, his expression going through several things in quick succession, when he saw her standing there in the dark. She held out the letter without saying anything. He took it from her hands. He unfolded it slowly, the way a man unfolds something he is not entirely sure he is ready to read. The lamplight caught the paper and threw Silas's shadow long and crooked across the porch boards behind him. He read it. She watched his face while he read, because she'd been watching his face for months now across a field, through a window, in the moment he came through her gate, and she had learned to read it the way you learn to read weather. The particular set of his jaw when he was holding something back. The way his eyes went very still when something struck him harder than he expected. She watched all of that happen now, line by line, as he moved through what Joseph had written. There was the moment when he read the part about pride, wearing formal clothes. She could see it, the slight flinch, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the look of a man who has been accurately described and does not entirely enjoy it. There was the moment he read the part about not knowing how to receive, and she watched his jaw shift and a long, slow exhale move through him, and his shoulders settle a quarter of an inch lower than they had been, the way a man's shoulders settle when he stops bracing for a blow that has already landed. And there was the moment near the end when he read what Joseph had written about her, about trusting her to find a way to give it to him that he could bear. She knew that moment by the way his eyes stopped moving for 3 full seconds, just stopped. And he stood there in the lamplight with the November dark around him and the first snow falling soft and thin in the light. And he did not move. When he finished, he folded the letter very carefully. He followed Joseph's original fold lines, exactly the creases already pressed deep into the paper, and he brought the edges together with his thick fingers with a precision that seemed to Willa like a form of respect, like the way you close a book you intend to read again. He stood with his head bowed. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that the letter had not already said better. Joseph had always been better with words than either of them, and he had chosen these particular words with the same care he brought to everything he considered worth doing properly. After a long moment, Silas put the letter in his breast pocket. She watched him place it next to whatever else lived there. She suspected the photograph of Margaret, because a man like Silas Dunn does not carry a photograph of his dead wife in his breast pocket for 5 years without it becoming part of his architecture, and they stood together on the porch in the cold November dark and let the silence be what it was. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That was the thing she noticed most, standing there. It was the first silence she could remember sharing with Silas Dunn that did not have the particular tightness of 2 people being careful around each other. It was simply quiet. The wind and the fence rails, the soft sound of snow on the roof, 2 people standing in the dark with nothing to perform for each other and nothing to defend. After a while, she said, "You should go in. You'll get cold." He looked at her. The lamplight was between them, and for a moment she could see his face clearly. The deep lines, the silver mustache, the steel-gray eyes that had been flat and closed for as long as she had known him, and were not quite flat and closed anymore. "Thank you," he said, "for bringing it." "He meant for you to have it," she said. "I know." A pause. "I meant thank you for the other thing, for finding a way." He looked down at the porch boards. "I wouldn't have taken it from a person standing in front of me. You knew that." "Yes," she said. "The pie was..." He stopped, seemed to reconsider, started again. "It was a kind thing to do, a thoughtful thing, and I ate every one of them without ever telling you so. And that was poor of me." Willa looked at him for a moment. The November wind moved through the apple trees at the far end of the yard, a sound like water. "You came across the field in the cold to tell me that," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. "All right," she said. "Good night, Mr. Dunn." "Good night, Mrs. Harper." She went inside. She stood at the kitchen window and watched his lamp move back across the dark field, a small moving point of amber in all that cold dark, until it reached the door of his farmhouse and disappeared inside. She stood at the window for a while after the light was gone. Then she went to bed. November came, and with it, the first snow of the season. 2 inches overnight, clean and even, the way the first snow always is, before the wind gets to it and rearranges it into something less orderly. It came quietly, the way snow does, and by the time Silas Dunn woke at his usual hour before dawn, it had finished, and the world outside his windows was a uniform, silent white. He dressed in the dark, the way he always did. He made his coffee on the wood stove, standing with his back to the warmth the way he had done 10,000 winter mornings, listening to the familiar sounds of a cold house coming reluctantly to life. The tick of the stove, the groan of the floorboard near the window, the wind finding the gap under the east door that he had been meaning to fix since September. He took his coffee out onto the porch. The cold came in immediately, the sharp, clean cold of Wyoming November that goes straight through whatever you are wearing and makes a direct case for going back inside. He stood it without moving. The field was white. The fence rails were white. The apple trees along the south line were bare and black against the white, their branches making the complicated dark geometry that bare trees make in winter, all the structure visible now that the leaves were gone. There was no pie on the rail. He noticed this the way you notice the absence of something that has become part of your morning, not with surprise exactly, more with the particular quality of attention that goes to a thing when it is no longer there. The way you notice, on a morning when the clock has stopped, that the house is quieter than usual. Not silence exactly, the specific quiet of a missing sound. He stood there drinking his coffee and looking at the bare rail, and thought about that. He had not asked Willa to bring the pies. He had not thanked her for bringing them. He had not, in 2 months of finding them on his porch rail before dawn, done anything beyond returning the tins clean, which was the minimum of acknowledgement available to a man who had committed himself entirely to not acknowledging anything. And she had kept bringing them anyway, not because she felt obligated, not because she was the kind of woman who did things out of obligation. He understood that about her now, understood it clearly in the way you understand something you should have seen much earlier. She had brought them because she chose to, because she had looked across a field one July morning and seen something that concerned her and decided to do something about it in the most practical, undemanding way she could devise. She had not made it about herself, had not made it about him, had just made pies and brought them across a field in the dark and gone home without knocking. He finished his coffee. The cold had gotten into the tin cup, and it was not particularly pleasant to drink by the end. He thought about what Joseph had written, about the necessity of receiving what is offered, about the particular pride that refuses help until the help is no longer available, and calls that refusal strength. He thought about the tin box under the floorboard, now sufficient, about the restructured mortgage terms, now signed, about the 12-acre south parcel, now legally his, the deed filed and certified and entered in Pettigrew's careful, cramped ledger. None of that, not one piece of it, had been accomplished alone. He went inside. He rinsed his cup. He stood in his kitchen for a moment, the wood stove ticking beside him, the snowlight coming in through the east window and lying flat and pale across the pine floor. Then he put on his coat and his hat and his good gloves, the leather ones he kept for cold weather, and he walked out across the field through the new snow. The snow was 2 inches deep and crusted just enough at the top to make a sound. With every step, the particular compressed squeak of walking on new snow in cold weather, a sound that carries far in winter air. His boots left clear tracks across the white field. He walked the fence line rather than cutting straight across, the way he had always done when he was thinking, because the fence line gave you something to follow and something to look at, and let the thinking happen on its own. He went through the gate. Willa was in the kitchen. He could see her through the window, the lamp already on, even at this hour, her moving between the stove and the table with the efficiency of a woman who has been running a household alone long enough that every movement has been reduced to its necessary minimum. She had not seen him yet. He knocked on the door. She answered it with a look that suggested she had been expecting him, which did not particularly surprise him. She had a way of being unsurprised by things he did not expect of himself, which he was beginning to understand was one of her particular gifts, or perhaps simply a result of paying attention to things he had spent 5 years hoping people would not notice. She was wearing her work dress, the dark green one, and her hair was not yet braided for the day, hanging loose around her shoulders, which was not a version of Willa Harper he had seen before. She seemed briefly aware of this, and then decided not to do anything about it, which also seemed characteristic. "I came to ask," Silas said. He stopped there for a moment. The sentence had seemed cleaner in his head on the walk over, when the only sound was his boots on the snow and the wind in the fence rails. Standing in an actual doorway with an actual person waiting for the rest of it, the words required more from him than he had anticipated. He tried again. "I came to ask if you would like some help with the orchard before the hard freeze comes. I know the ground is already cold and there's not much time left before it's too hard to work, but I've been meaning to offer since..." He stopped. "Since the parcel came to me. The trees are on my land now. It seems like I should be doing some of the work." "I would," she said. "Yes." He nodded. He was about to say good and turn to go and come back in an hour with his tools, which was what he would have done 6 months ago, 3 months ago, possibly even last week. Instead, he said, "And I wanted to say something else." Willa waited. "I should have thanked you," he said. "For the pies, I knew it was you. I've known since the 4th one. And I never said anything, not once, through 2 full months of finding them on that rail in the morning. I let it go on without a word, and that wasn't right." He looked at the door frame, then back at her. "I was grateful. I was more than grateful. I just didn't know how to say so in a way that wouldn't require me to say other things alongside it, things I wasn't ready to say." Willa looked at him with the particular steadiness of a woman who has decided not to make something easier than it needs to be, but also not harder than it needs to be. "You returned the tins clean," she said. "That's not the same as thanking you." "No," she said, "but it was something. For a man who couldn't say it yet, it was something. I understood what it meant." He considered this. "You shouldn't have to translate a man's silences to find the courtesy in them." "Maybe not," she said, "but it's not the worst thing to know how." He looked at her for a moment. The morning light was coming in from the east now, pale and diffuse through the overcast, the particular quality of light that comes through clouds over snow, not warm, but very clear. It lit the side of her face and made her freckles very visible and cast a small shadow from her eyelashes on her cheek. "I've been alone a long time," he said. He said it the way you say something you have been carrying for so long it has become simply the description of a fact rather than a complaint about it. Not with self-pity, not with an expectation of anything in response, just the stating of a condition, the way you might say the north fence post needs resetting or the hay yield was down this year. "I know," Willa said. "So have I." They stood in the doorway for a moment with that between them, not uncomfortable, not requiring resolution. Just present the way honest things are present when they've finally been said out loud. "I'll get my tools," Silas said. "An hour. I'll have coffee on," she said. He walked back across the field. His tracks going out were still clear in the snow. His tracks coming back ran alongside them, 2 parallel lines across the white field, the going and the returning of the same man on the same morning. He thought that was probably something Joseph would have had a comment about. Something quiet and precise and a little bit pleased with itself. He thought this with something close to affection, which surprised him, and then did not. And there in the white November morning, with the bare apple trees at the far end of the field and the mountains beyond them, and the tracks of a man who had gone to ask for something and been given it. Crossing the snow in both directions, 2 people who had both spent years mistaking their grief for independence had arrived without ceremony or announcement at the threshold of something that had not yet been given a name, but was already, undeniably, a direction. By the time the real winter settled in the deep committed cold that arrives in Wyoming in December and makes no apologies for its intentions. Silas Dunn had learned 3 things about apple trees, and 1 thing about himself. The 3 things about apple trees required work to learn. Willa taught them without teaching, the way people who are very good at something often instruct by doing the thing and allowing you to watch, and then waiting with patience for you to understand what you have been watching. The first thing, that apple trees need to be pruned before the hard freeze, not after. The pruning is not for now. It is not for this season, which is already gone. The pruning is for the shape of the tree over the next 5 years, the clearing of the crossing branches, the removal of the wood that is growing back into itself instead of out and up, so that the structure beneath has room to breathe and light to reach the interior. You are not doing this for yourself. You are doing it for the tree you want to exist in 5 years, in 10, which may or may not be a tree you are still alive to see. The second thing, that Willa grew a variety called Roxbury russet, which Joseph had ordered from a nursery in Vermont 6 years before his death, a choice that had struck everyone in Sheridan County who heard about it as eccentric, bordering on foolish. A Vermont apple in Wyoming. But Joseph had done his research. He had corresponded with the nursery owner and with 2 farmers in Colorado who had tried the variety at similar elevation, and the Roxbury russet had turned out to be precisely suited to the conditions along the Harper South fence line. Better suited, in fact, than anything grown by anyone else in that part of Sheridan County. The apples were small and irregular, not beautiful in the way that makes people buy apples at market, but dense and tart and with a complexity of flavor that deepened in storage through the winter. Joseph had understood something about those trees that most people had not given him credit for understanding. Silas thought about that. The third thing, that working in an apple orchard in winter is cold work and slow work and mostly invisible work. The pruning cuts are small, the changes to the tree are not visible until spring, and on any given morning it is genuinely difficult to determine whether you have accomplished anything. You have to trust the process without being able to verify it. You have to believe that what you are doing to the tree is good for it, not because you can see it yet, but because you understand, in principle, how trees work. Silas, who had spent 31 years farming and knew a great deal about how things grow, found this straightforward enough as a practical matter. As a metaphor, it was somewhat harder to ignore. The thing about himself took longer to name, as things about yourself always do. But by the time December had settled in fully and the cold had its teeth into the ground for the season, he had arrived at something that felt accurate. He had confused being uncomplaining with being strong, and they are not the same thing. Being uncomplaining is a discipline. It is a choice not to add your pain to the pile of pain that already exists in the world, which is a generous impulse and not a bad habit. But it becomes, over time, if you are not careful, if you mistake the discipline for the whole way of not allowing yourself to be known, a way of requiring nothing from anyone, a way of making your existence as low maintenance as possible so that no one need concern themselves with you, so that no one need be burdened by the fact of you. This is not strength. Silas understood that now. It is loneliness organized into a system and given a name that sounds like virtue, so that you can live inside it without shame. Margaret had known this. She had known it and tried to tell him, and he had not been ready to hear it. He was sorry about that now, in the specific, quiet way you are sorry about things for which there is no remedy, not with drama, not with the kind of grief that performs itself, but with the simple acknowledgement that you were wrong about something important, and you would have done it differently if you had understood sooner. He carried that acknowledgement the way he carried everything, in his breast pocket, next to the photograph, next to the deed, next to Joseph's letter. The things that needed keeping, kept close. He learned the lesson about himself not from a speech or a revelation or a single dramatic moment, but from the accumulation of small mornings. The mornings when he came across the field and Willa had the coffee already on, without being asked, without making anything of it, just a cup on the table, and the lamp lit, and the stove going, and a woman who had decided that this was now part of how mornings worked. He had, the first 2 or 3 times, started to say that she didn't have to. He had stopped himself before the words came out, because he was trying, with some effort and mixed success, to practice receiving without comment. The mornings in the orchard when they worked alongside each other, and Willa pointed out what needed cutting, and he cut it, and she moved on to the next tree, and he followed. And the whole thing had the quality of a conversation that required no words, which was the kind of conversation Silas was best at, but had not had with anyone in a very long time. The mornings when he fixed the shared fence line between the south parcel and the Harper property, resetting posts that had worked loose and replacing rails that had rotted through work he could do alone, had done alone, but which Willa came out to help with on the second morning, holding the post while he drove it, handing him nails, not because the work required 2 people, but because she had looked out the window and seen him and decided to come out, which was its own kind of statement. The mornings when he woke in his own house, in his own bed, in the same 4 walls where he had woken alone for 5 years, and the first thought in his head before the list of what needed doing that day was not the tin box, not the balance, not the calendar showing how many days to January, but something more like, "It is Tuesday. She will be in the orchard." That was when he knew the walls were coming down. Not dramatically, not overnight. The way walls come down when they actually come down, which is rarely by spectacular collapse, more often board by board, nail by nail, the structure reducing itself so gradually that you barely notice the change until you look up one morning and find that you are standing in the open and the air is different out here, and you had forgotten that open air has a quality the inside of a wall does not. On a cold afternoon, at the end of January, the last day of January, as it happened, the sky the flat white of deep winter, and the thermometer outside the kitchen window reading 9 degrees Fahrenheit, which was cold even for Wyoming, and was the kind of cold that makes you grateful for every living thing that has chosen to be warm beside you. Silas Dunn put on his coat and his hat and his good leather gloves and walked across the field to Willa Harper's door. She answered it before he could knock a second time, which suggested she had heard him on the porch. "I'd like to sit for a while," he said. "On the porch, if that's agreeable." She looked at him. "It's 9 degrees, she said. "I know what it is," he said. A pause. "There's no pie today," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him for another moment with that particular expression. She had the one that contained several things simultaneously that he had been trying to read correctly for months and was only now beginning to trust his reading of. "All right," she said. She got her coat from the hook by the door, the good wool one, the dark one, not the work coat. She wrapped the scarf around her neck. She put on her gloves. She got her coat. They went out onto the porch together. They sat in the 2 chairs Willa kept out there even in the depths of winter, because Joseph had always maintained that a porch without chairs was just a step, and she had maintained this after him without particularly deciding to, the way you maintain some of the small habits of the dead simply because they were right, and they pulled their coats close and looked out at the snow-covered fields and the mountains beyond. The mountains in January were a particular thing. The summer mountains were dramatic, photogenic, the kind of view that makes people stop their wagons and look. But the January mountains had something different, a permanence, a weight, a quality of having been there before anything else, and fully intending to remain after everything else was gone. They were white from base to summit now, the same flat white as the fields below them, so that on days like this, the line between ground and mountain was hard to find, and it looked as if the whole world had simply folded upward at some point in the far distance, white rising into white, immovable and indifferent and magnificent. They sat with that for a while. Willa had her gloved hands around a tin mug she had brought out, and Silas had his hands in his pockets, and neither of them said anything for a good while, and it was not difficult. After a time, Willa said, "Joseph would have liked this." Silas considered this. He thought about Joseph Harper as he now understood him, which was differently from how he had understood him before. Before, Joseph had been a good neighbor, a man who kept his fence on his side of the line and returned borrowed tools promptly and could be counted on in a practical emergency. These were not small things, but now Silas understood other things about him, the patience with which he had watched his neighbor across the field building himself into a smaller and smaller version of himself year after year, the care with which he had made a plan, not an obvious plan, not a plan that announced itself, but a quiet plan, a plan that trusted 2 other people to carry it out after he was gone. The letter he had written to nobody and everybody, explaining himself to the air. The deed witnessed and dated and tucked away, waiting. Joseph Harper had been, Silas now understood, a man of very long thoughts. He would have been insufferably pleased with himself, Silas said. Willa laughed. It was a real laugh, not the careful, managed variety of laughter that people produce in social situations, the laughter that is a courtesy more than a response. This was the other kind, the unguarded kind, the kind that arrives before you have time to decide whether to let it, and sounds exactly like the person it comes from and nothing else. He had not heard Willa Harper laugh before, not like that. He had heard her voice, direct and measured and occasionally dry in a way he had come to appreciate, but not this. Not the unguarded version. It was the most beautiful sound Silas Dunn had heard in 5 years. He didn't say that. He was not the kind of man who said things like that. And even if he had been, the moment was already perfect without it, and he had enough sense, finally, not to add to something that was already complete. He sat a little longer than he might have in the cold January light on someone else's porch, with the kind of quiet that comes between two people who have stopped performing anything for each other. The mountains were white and permanent. The fields were white and still. The apple trees along the south fence line were bare and black against the snow, holding in their winter structure all the shape of the fruit they would put out in summer. The Roxbury russets, dense and tart, a Vermont variety that had turned out to suit Wyoming rather well, which Joseph had known and most people had underestimated. Silas thought about the pie. He thought about the morning the knife had stopped, the folded paper, the greased translucent edges, his own name in a dead man's handwriting, waiting in the center of an apple pie on a porch rail in October, having traveled from Joseph Harper's careful hand through Willa Harper's careful kitchen, through 2 months of cold pre-dawn crossings of a dark field to arrive in his. He had almost not cut it. He had almost left the paper folded. He had almost put it in his breast pocket that morning without opening it, and carried it there for days or weeks or indefinitely, the way proud men carry things they are not ready to face, close to the heart, thoroughly avoided. But he had cut it, and the knife had stopped. And after that, things had been different, not overnight, not dramatically, not in the way that stories are sometimes told, where the revelation arrives complete and the person it arrives to is immediately and permanently changed. That is not how people change. That is how people describe change after the fact, once the distance is sufficient to make the path look straight. In reality, it had been slow. It had been one cold morning at a time. It had been returning tins and filing deeds and going through mortgage documents at a kitchen table by lamplight and walking across snowy fields to ask for things he had spent 5 years refusing to ask for. It had been pruning apple trees in the wrong season of his life and finding in that work something he recognized. But it had happened, and he was sitting on a porch in January in 9-degree weather next to a woman who had crossed a cold field in the dark before dawn 2 times a week for 2 months to leave something on his rail without knocking. And she had just laughed, and the mountains were white, and the fields were white, and somewhere underneath the snow, the apple trees were holding the shape of next summer's fruit. That seemed, to Silas Dunn, like enough. There is a lesson in that, though I am not sure it is the kind that gets framed and hung on a wall. It is more the kind you carry in a breast pocket, next to a photograph, next to a folded deed, next to a dead man's letter about the necessity of receiving what is freely given. The kind you take out in the quiet moments in the kitchen before dawn, in the orchard in the cold, on a porch in January with someone who laughs the way she means it, to remind yourself that pride is not the same as strength, that solitude is not the same as peace, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is cut into the pie someone left them and be willing to see what's inside. Joseph Harper had known all of that. He had known it with the particular clarity of a man who watched the people he loved clearly and planned accordingly. He had signed a deed 2 weeks before he died and trusted it to a folded paper pressed into apple pie filling before baking, and trusted that to a woman with dark red hair and an early morning habit, and trusted that to a stubborn old man who he believed, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, was still capable of being surprised into openness. He had been right about the woman, and the woman had been right about the pie, and the pie, as it turned out, had been right about everything. Thank you for being here today. If this story held you, consider what it means to carry your grief like a wall instead of a wound. Silas Dunn spent 5 years calling his loneliness dignity, and it took a dead man's gift and a woman who baked in the dark before dawn to show him that receiving, sometimes, is the braver act. There is no shame in the paper someone folded into the pie they left on your porch. There is only the question of whether you are willing to open it. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. Until then, keep the light on the porch.